Hi, BookTube. Welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Now, last time we were together, we didn't get very far, did we? We left off in the middle of page 96 in chapter 11, and that's because the narrative was getting ready to turn its attention to a new character. Rosamond Vincy is about to walk on to the Middlemarch stage, and I have a feeling she's a character who's going to be just as important as Dorothea Brooke, but in a very different way. She's a very different person. You'll know the difference when we study the text. I found it because suddenly it was so much easier to close read those parts of Middlemarch that dealt with Rosamond Vincy than it was to read passages where we were with Dorothea Brooke. And I think that's because with the character of Dorothea, George Eliot, she could showcase her own intellect, hers and Dorothea's. And so the text was just, it was so crowded, wasn't it, with references to historic events, persons who influenced history, and in particular, those who influenced faith or religious thinking. The writing was so heavy with all those references that we stopped a lot to do a little bit of in-depth research. With Rosamond, different altogether. And because of that, I predict that we should be able, in this session, to get to the end of chapter 11, even though that's twice as much material as we normally cover. Today's graphic comes courtesy of Mrs. Beeton's Manual of Household Management. These are two options for winter breakfast menus, and they're to give you an idea, if you're not already familiar with the kind of fare which would have been expected if you lived in a better household for breakfast every day. Literally, this isn't just a special breakfast, or this is the sort of thing that normally now you might expect to be on offer in a nice hotel, an expensive hotel. But this is the sort of thing that would have been expected in a nicer home, and certainly the Vincy's home. It sounds like, as we read the text, you'll get the impression that there were a lot of things on offer for breakfast, a lot of things already on the table, and a lot of things that you could ask the servants to prepare for you. Anyway, we will get to that. We're going to go straight into the text now so we can get through chapter 11. Here we go. Lidgett could not be long in Middlemarch without having that agreeable vision, and we know from last time that agreeable vision is Rosamond herself, her physical appearance, quite apart from her accomplishments at Mrs. Lemon's school, but we will hear more of that, or even without making the acquaintance of the Vincy family. For though Mr. Peacock, whose practice he had paid something to enter on, okay, now we already have to stop. What? How does that work? Before 1948, when the British National Health Service was formed, general practitioners of medicine operated like small independent businesses. They had their own customer base, and so a doctor at the point of retirement, as Mr. Peacock may have been, we're not entirely sure here, but he could sell his practice to the incoming doctor, and what was being sold was the goodwill, the trust of the patients built up over time. I could not find out how this was calculated in the 1830s, so I don't know how much money it would have been. The Nuffield Trust is an independent think tank organisation that provides research and policy analysis for the UK's National Health Service. They give a short, sketchy history of medical practice before the NHS was founded, but they don't cite references or give precise dates for some of the facts that they state. But for what it's worth, they do say this, and I'm quoting, "Entry into a practice was generally by purchase of goodwill, the usual price being 1.5 times the annual income. GPs started with a substantial debt." So I think that's important to note for Lidgett. I think that will matter later. And of course, we're using the term GP. This wouldn't apply to the 1830s because there weren't general practitioners at that point. However, I still think Eliot's statement here suggests that something similar was happening around about the 1830s, that when one doctor was leaving the practice and another one wished to take it on, he needed to buy the goodwill from the outgoing practitioner. So Dr. Lidgett was probably, I think it does say later in the paragraph, maybe if I keep reading it will say, but certainly he might have been in a lot of debt as he's starting his business. And I think the first part of chapter 11 actually does hint at that, doesn't it? That he wasn't planning to marry because he'd spent a great deal of money to get himself into the practice. So he paid something to enter on it. So anyway, going back to the sentence itself, it talks about how he couldn't possibly not have got to know the Vincy family. For though Mr. Peacock, whose practice he had paid something to enter on, had not been their doctor, not been the Vincy's doctor, and that's because Mrs. Vincy didn't like not liking the lowering system adopted by him. You have to go back to earlier episodes to understand what lowering system means. He had many patients among their connections and acquaintances, for who of any consequence in Middlemarch was not connected or at least acquainted with the Vincys? Well, that rhetorical question means they are somebody. If you lived in Middlemarch, you wouldn't have to live there long before you'd heard about the Vincys. They were old manufacturers and had kept a good house for 3 generations, in which there had naturally been much intermarrying with neighbours more or less decidedly genteel. Now we're going to get an account of exactly how genteel, most likely. Mr. Vincy's sister had made a wealthy match in accepting Mr. Bulstrode, whom we have already met, who, however, as a man not born in the town and altogether of dimly known origin, was considered to have done well in uniting himself with a real Middlemarch family. Okay, I'm laughing now because this is how local this kind of class snobbery can get. On the other hand, Mr. Vincy, and this is critical, Mr. Vincy had descended a little, having taken an innkeeper's daughter. And that's very important. In terms of social order of things, Mr. Vincy, that is Rosamond's father, having come from this line of manufacturers that have established themselves over 3 generations, and it says they kept a good house, meaning they kept out of debt, they kept their business growing. That was very important. So by the time you get to the 3rd generation, they acquire greater respectability. To then marry an innkeeper's daughter, anyone who had to do work with their own hands, which Mr. Vincy would no longer have had to do. As a manufacturer, he would have owned a factory, other people would have done that for him. So that raised him up a little bit. But an innkeeper's daughter, an innkeeper has to get his hands dirty, he has to get in there and run his premises. So that's downscaling ever so slightly. But nevertheless, these things mattered so much. So this is one thing. So Mr. Vincy had come down a little bit by marrying an innkeeper's daughter. However, it says here, but on this side there was a cheering sense of money. Of course, money always helps. For Mrs. Vincy's sister had been second wife to rich old Mr. Featherstone. We have not met Mr. Featherstone yet. And then it says, and had died childless years ago, so that her nephews and nieces might be supposed to touch the affections of the widower. So very important, even though Mr. Vincy has married an innkeeper's daughter, that innkeeper had 2 daughters, and his other daughter got a much better match. She married Featherstone, and apparently he's got a heck of a lot of money, and he died childless. Brilliant. That means that the inheritance will most likely go to Mr. Vincy's children, just because they are Mr. Featherstone's nephews and nieces. So, moving on to page 97. And it happened that Mr. Bulstrode and Mr. Featherstone, 2 of Peacock's most important patients, had, from different causes, given an especially good reception to his successor, who had raised some partisanship as well as discussion. Mr. Wrench, medical attendant to the Vincy family, very early had grounds for thinking lightly of Lydgate's professional discretion, and there was no report about him which was not retailed at the Vincys, where visitors were frequent. Mr. Vincy was more inclined to general good fellowship than to taking sides, but there was no need for him to be hasty in making any new man's acquaintance. Rosamond silently wished that her father would invite Mr. Lydgate. And you can see that the only reason Rosamond's father hasn't is because he's getting some information from Mr. Wrench, who doesn't particularly like Lydgate, doesn't think that there's something lacking in his professional discretion. I don't know what that means, but I would be interested to find out. She was tired of the faces and figures she had always been used to, the various irregular profiles and gaits and turns of phrase distinguishing those Middlemarch young men whom she had known as boys. So that she's always known. And I think this sentence is key. She had been at school with girls of higher position, whose brothers she felt sure it would have been possible for her to be more interested in. So she's looking back at her school days at Mrs. Lemon's, and what she's wanting is to better herself, to move herself upward. We should talk a little bit about these schools. There's a lovely quote. I found an article at JSTOR by Russell M. Goldfarb. Now, Goldfarb was the professor of English and American literature at Western Michigan University, and he passed away in September 2023. So this is an article that he wrote in 1986, and he says, the accomplished female of the time, that is, we're talking about the early 19th century, who graduated from schools similar to Miss Pinkerton's in Vanity Fair, or the Ladies' Seminary in the Old Curiosity Shop, or Miss Twinkleton's in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, was not taught to think critically or analytically. That's important. In academic disciplines reserved for male scholars. But the young lady would have received instruction in music, dancing, spelling, embroidery, needlework, and certain extras, such as getting in and out of a carriage, taught at Mrs. Lemon's school. If George Eliot is laughing at this point, she is not laughing at Rosamond Vincy, but at the prestigious county schools that took pride at the mental acquisition of their students. The girls were taught a woman's role in society, and that role was not intellectually demanding. And I've also included a link to a blog which quotes some advertisements at the time for various ladies' seminaries and boarding schools dating back to 1813, 1814. You get a feel for the subjects that were considered important: dance, needlework, music, French, drawing, some arithmetic, no mathematics, but arithmetic, writing, and geography taught with globes. I'm not sure what more there was done there, apart from the ability to identify places on a globe. And Charles Dickens, of course, made fun of these schools. He created a fictional version in his Sketches by Boz that was published in 1834. I'm quoting now. Minerva House, conducted under the auspices of the two sisters, was a finishing establishment for young ladies, where some 20 girls of the ages of from 13 to 19 inclusive acquired a smattering of everything and a knowledge of nothing, instruction in French and Italian, dancing lessons twice a week, and other necessaries of life. What the school has taught Rosamond, though, is that she, having done so well at Mrs. Lemon's school, could consider herself just as attractive a marriage partner for a young man of higher social standing, because they were the brothers of some of her classmates. And this is important to note, that Rosamond is doing what the Vincy family has worked to do over the past 3 generations, and that is keep a good house, build their social standing. So she is going right along with that. But resuming where we were, so I'll reread that critical sentence. She had been at school with girls of higher position, whose brothers she felt sure it would have been possible for her to be more interested in than in these inevitable Middlemarch companions. But she would not have chosen to mention her wish to her father, and he, for his part, was in no hurry on the subject. Why? An alderman about to be mayor must by and by enlarge his dinner parties, absolutely. But at present there were plenty of guests at his well-spread table. I think that well-spread table is significant. I think it says something about Mrs. Vincy, and the rest of this chapter is going to drop hints at that in terms of hospitality, and I'll pick that up as we go. Let's carry on here. That table often remained covered with the relics of the family breakfast long after Mr. Vincy had gone with his second son. Primogeniture would suggest he would normally go with his first son to the warehouse, to his place of business, but he's gone with his second son. And when Miss Morgan, and this I believe must be their governess, was already far on in the morning lessons with the younger girls in the schoolroom. It awaited the family laggard. So the breakfast table was waiting for the family laggard, or layabout, lazy person. I think most people know that word, but that's what it means if anyone's new to that term. The laggard who found any sort of inconvenience, in brackets, to others, less disagreeable than getting up when he was called. And this is an important thing to note too. In 19th century well-to-do homes, meal times were a set time. It was almost institutional. And there would be a bell that would ring for the various meals, or servants would be dispatched to bedrooms in the morning because they would have to light fires and bring tea and so on, and they would let their guests or the residents know when breakfast was ready. And you were expected to be down and dressed to take those meals when they were served. Not to do so became a difficulty for the kitchen, because the staff had, it was much harder work. There were far fewer appliances. Cooking and preparing the food was much more manual, took longer, and therefore, really, if it was ready, especially if it was hot food, you needed to sit down and eat it then. And so this might sound like a small thing, but it really, to have been called to breakfast and to have not shown up was really bad behavior, very bad behavior. Anyway, where did I leave off? I've already lost my place. This was the case one morning of the October in which we have lately seen Mr. Casaubon visiting the Grange. Okay, so it's just putting us in the time frame. We're effectively moving back in time now. We've already covered a period with Mr. Casaubon and Dorothea courting, and basically, in their story, it's getting on toward Christmas. But this story backs up a bit and said, let's go back to October, because then there was something happening at the Vincy's home. And though the room was a little overheated with the fire, which had sent the spaniel panting to a remote corner, so the dog is getting a little bit too warm, Rosamond, for some reason, continued to sit at her embroidery longer than usual, now and then giving herself a little shake and laying her work on her knee to contemplate it, with an air of hesitating weariness. And we will find out what is it that she is waiting for, what is it that's keeping her there. Her mamma, who had returned from an excursion to the kitchen, sat on the other side of the small work table with an air of more entire placidity, until the clock again, giving notice that it was going to strike, she looked up from the lace mending which was occupying her plump fingers and rang the bell. So, things to notice. This is an inventory, really, of the rest of the Vincy household and their adherence to the family's ambitions. We know about Rosamond and her father. Now we see that the Vincy's second son has gone with his father to their warehouse. So he's the one, aspiring to maintain the status quo. The younger girls are in the schoolroom. That's right. That's what they should be doing, lessons, and that's what Rosamond would have been doing when she was their age. Mrs. Vincy has been visiting the kitchen, which is a perfectly acceptable activity for the female head of household, and now both women are doing needlework. So they are keeping occupied in one of the things that a well-to-do woman, was expected to do with her leisure time. It's October, and it's important to note this because universities begin their new academic year in October, right? So bear that in mind. And we've got one family member who's out of step. Everybody else is playing the game of maintaining the good house. You remember, 3 generations, they've kept a good house. Well, we've got a problem now, because we've got one family member who's out of step. And it seems to me that this is concerning Rosamond in one way or another. That may not be true, but at the point we are now, I'm thinking, well, this seems to be bothering her. Her mother, by contrast, no, not so worried. So we need to find out why. At the top of page 98, we find a servant has come into the breakfast room, and Mrs. Vincy says to him, "Knock at Mr. Fred's door again, Pritchard, and tell him it has struck 10:30. This was said without any change in the radiant good humour of Mrs. Vincy's face, in which 45 years had delved neither angles nor parallels, and pushing back her pink cap strings, she let her work rest on her lap while she looked admiringly at her daughter. "Mamma," said Rosamond, "when Fred comes down, I wish you would not let him have red herrings. I cannot bear the smell of them all over the house at this hour of the morning." We should pause there. Red herrings. we'll take this one. Red herrings. What Rosamond dislikes so much is a form of food preservation that dates back 200 years. Fresh herrings were caught in quantity all around the UK seacoast, and to keep them from spoiling, they were usually laid out, coated in a brine, and then they were dried in a smoker, which turned the silvery skin of the fish a very dark, rusty red color. They were very, very fragrant. And that's putting it diplomatically. Some people would just say they stink. There is an apocryphal story that red herrings were used to teach hunting dogs not to get distracted from the scent trail of the animal that they were meant to be tracking. And from that story, we get the literary concept of a red herring. You know the thing in crime fiction, where there's a clue that distracts the investigator or the reader. In fact, it's meant to distract the reader. And it gives the story a longer life, and it gives the reader a more intellectually satisfying puzzle to solve. And when herrings are cooked, and they're usually poached, but they can also be fried, they produce an incredible odor, which does hang in the air. It would have hung in the air down in the staff kitchens in the house, but also in that beautiful dining room with that well-laid table. The smell would linger in that little room for a long, long time, quite a couple of hours. And so it just underlines what the text has already said about how much Mr. Fred Vincy, as we're going to meet him, how much he loves, how much it pleases him to inconvenience other people. But anyway, let's read on. Oh, my dear, you are so hard on your brothers. It is the only fault I have to find with you. You are the sweetest temper in the world, but you are so tetchy with your brothers. Not tetchy, Mamma. You never hear me speak in an unladylike way. Well, but you want to deny them things. Brothers are so unpleasant. Oh, my dear, you must allow for young men. Interesting concept. Be thankful if they have good hearts. A woman must learn to put up with little things. Okay. You will be married someday. Not to anyone who is like Fred. Don't decry your own brother, my dear. Few young men have less against them, although he couldn't take his degree. I'm sure I can't understand why, for he seems to me most clever, and you know yourself he was thought equal to the best society at college. So particular as you are, my dear, I wonder you are not glad to have such a gentlemanly young man for a brother. You are always finding fault with Bob, because he is not Fred. Oh, no, Mamma, only because he is Bob. We don't know what that's about. Perhaps we'll find out. Well, my dear, you will not find any Middlemarch young man who has not something against him. But here Rosamond's face broke into a smile which suddenly revealed two dimples. She herself thought unfavorably of these dimples and smiled little in general society. Interesting. That makes her a little bit like Dorothy, I think. She goes on to say, but I shall not marry any Middlemarch young man. Whoa. Okay, so she's in charge. And Mrs. Vincy says, so it seems, my love, for you have as good as refused the pick of them. And if there's better to be had, I'm sure there's no girl better deserves it. And we'll stop there. I will carry on with that a little bit later. So here again, we've got Rosamond's ambition. She's very clear about it. And I think what I do discern in her that is like Dorothea is a powerful drive to something. Now with Dorothea, it was to, I don't know, do something incredible. She, a Saint Teresa-like, just, revolutionize the world beyond herself. Not so Rosamond Vincy. Rosamond Vincy's ambitions are narrower, but you could say they are not at all unusual or eccentric, which is how Dorothea is perceived by others around her, particularly other women. Rosamond Vincy's ambitions would not have seemed peculiar at all. In fact, it would have seemed quite right that she is trying to aim for a marriage that is socially slightly better than where she is now. She's looking to elevate herself socially. That's a good ambition for a woman, and the only way you can do it is marriage. So far, I don't see anything but a very determined, ambitious young woman in the way that, the only way that the 19th century accepted ambition in women. So, Now we'll carry on, and we'll talk about this phrase that Mrs. Vincy used. She said, "You have as good as refused the pick of them." And down at the bottom of the page, Rosamond says, "Excuse me, Mamma, I wish you would not say the pick of them." Now we're going to find out what that's about. So this is a lovely exchange here on page 99, which says something revealing about Rosamond, something we've already had a hint of before, but this is that same fact being demonstrated. So Mrs. Vincy wants to know why her daughter objects so much. She says, "Why? What else are they? In other words, what was wrong with me saying the pick of them?" And Rosamond says, "I mean, Mamma, it is a rather vulgar expression." "Very likely, my dear. I never was a good speaker. What should I say?" "The best of them." "Why, that seems just as plain and common. If I had had time to think, I should have said the most superior young men. But with your education, you must know." Well, we already know what Rosamond's education actually consists of. And I don't honestly know why she objects to her mother saying the pick of them. The only thing I could think is that picking has a manual connotation. It has an agricultural, mercantile connotation, being about the value of a commercial product. We say the pick of the crop, the pick of the litter. So whereas the best of them could refer to a quality rather than a quantity. And also, of course, pick is a verb. And to pick, you must use your hand. And of course, all manual labor falls beneath administrative labor, socially, in English social terms in the 19th century, and of course above the administrative labor is not laboring at all and having everybody else do your work for you. That was the highest form. So you can see that it's saying the pick of them reveals, I suppose, Mrs. Vincy's social origins. If her father was an innkeeper, he would have been buying supplies in, he would have been haggling with buyers or people that brought him provisions to cook and serve at the inn, and so she probably saw a lot of that, and to say the pick of them probably came quite naturally to her. And Rosamond is bothered by it because it is reminding her of her mother's social standing, and of course she's trying so hard. She's already moved up higher just because her mother married better. Rosamond needs to get above that. Rosamond's got ambitions to go further. So it pains her to be reminded that in her own family, in her own DNA, if that's even a thing, if it's possible to have class in your DNA, Rosamond would think it was, I suppose, and she needs to get above. And so it bothers her to be reminded of these things. Now we're going to go on, and I think we're finally going to meet Mr. Fred Vincy. "What must Rosie know, Mother?" said Mr. Fred, who had slid in unobserved through the half-open door while the ladies were bending over their work, and now, going up to the fire, stood with his back towards it, warming the soles of his slippers. So he's not even dressed yet. It is past 10:30 in the morning. He is still not fully dressed, and he's finally coming down, sneaking down into the dining room. He's obviously made sure that he's come in when he's not going to be observed coming in. And Mrs. Vincy tells him whether it's right to say superior young men, said Mrs. Vincy, ringing the bell. She's summoning the servants now. Mr. Fred now wants to eat, so you're going to have to work around that. And Fred answers, "Oh, there are so many superior teas and sugars now. Superior is getting to be shopkeeper's slang." "Are you beginning to dislike slang, then?" said Rosamond with mild gravity. Now she's needling. So obviously there's a difference between brother and sister that we're going to start picking up on. So she's accusing him of, "Oh, well, you've never been bothered before. Suddenly are you troubled by slang?" He now says, "Only the wrong sort. All choice of words is slang. It marks a class." Now, so he's needling back at her. There is no such thing as non-slang. All language, all choice of language is a choice made to reflect class. And to be fair, in 19th century England, that was true. That was true. Perhaps it may be more difficult to distinguish that today, but we're not talking about today. We're talking about this novel and its setting in the 1830s. And it was very true. Your choice of words meant a lot. The way you said words, the way you formed sentences, and the language that you used. Rosamond, she says that there is correct English. Oh, she's been taught that. You can just tell. That is not slang. And Fred comes back and says, I beg your pardon. Correct English is the slang of prigs. I coloured that in because I just thought, that should be framed and put in a picture on the wall. Correct English is the slang of prigs. We're going to talk about what is a prig, but I'm laughing. But what he's saying is even what we call correct English, what we are taught in school and badgered about, is nevertheless a selected choice of words, and it's chosen probably by the people who have enough power to enforce their opinion over all others, or they have so much power that however they speak is considered correct because everyone wants to aspire to greater power. He goes on to say, correct English is the slang of prigs who write history and essays, and the strongest slang of all is the slang of poets. Okay, interesting point. You will say anything, Fred, to gain your point. Well, he says, tell me whether it is slang or poetry to call an ox a leg plater. Now this is him trapping Rosamond regarding this business of calling an ox a leg plater. Now he's saying, tell me, Rosamond, is that slang or poetry? And she says, of course you can call it poetry if you like. So what she's having, that's her roundabout way of saying, I don't think it's poetry, I think it's slang. And then, of course, he's able to trap her. He says, aha, Miss Rosie, you don't know Homer from slang. And that's a terrible insult. It really is, because, and he's correct, he's absolutely correct, and this is the little bit of graphic I'm going to show you. This comes from Charles Anthon's first 6 books of Homer's Iliad, as you can see, and now I can't read Greek, so those of you who can, the word that I have highlighted yellow there, this is the term that Homer uses, and he does in fact refer to oxen as leg platers. And because oxen trail along and they plate their hind legs. In other words, the way an ox walks, it crosses, its back legs cross in front of each other as it moves. So he called it a leg plater. So Fred, however, I think this is really not nice. But there does seem to be a strange little rivalry going on between these two. It's a rivalry of who really knows more. Rosamond, who's gone to this lovely school of Miss Lemons and has distinguished herself, or Fred Vincy, who has gone to university. We do seem to know that much, but for how long, we're not sure. And what he's trying to show here is that he's superior. He has knowledge that she does not have. He's trying to prove that point, just so that she does, perhaps, to sort of say, don't get so full of yourself. You don't know what you think you know. But, I mean, he's also not acknowledging the truth, which is that classical literature, in its original languages, or even in translation, it was something that was rarely shared or taught to young women. It wasn't considered a good thing to do. So, Fred, we're going to see, likes talking about prigs. Prig is probably his favorite insult word, at least in the rest of chapter 11. But by his own definition, and we'll get to that on page 101, by his own definition, a prig is a fellow who is always making you a present of his opinions. And you see, Fred is a prig by that definition. He's pushing to give Rosamond what he knows, to tell her what he knows, even though she's not asked for it. She's not asked for this discussion. She's not asked for him to take her up. He didn't need to enter into this argument with this little sparring match, but he has. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I felt it was good to just sort of get in the spirit of that. Once again, going back where we left off. Aha, Miss Rosie, you don't know Homer from slang. I shall invent a new game. I shall write bits of slang and poetry on slips and give them to you to separate. So he's continuing in this teasing, this you don't know as much as you think you do. And she doesn't get to answer, because Mrs. Vincy, who seems to be some kind of peacekeeper, says, "Dear me, how amusing it is to hear young people talk," said Mrs. Vincy with cheerful admiration. She doesn't seem to be noticing that there's a little bit of acid going back and forth in this exchange. She doesn't seem to want to address that. "Have you got nothing else for my breakfast, Pritchard?" This is how Fred addresses. He said Fred to the servant who brought in coffee and buttered toast, which they must have had to scramble around to get, because coffee isn't something that you're going to keep cooking too long, it gets bitter the longer it's kept. And again, buttered toast has to be, and that would have to be done over an open fire. That wouldn't be a toaster. That would be some poor girl with the prong standing there toasting slices of the bread. So they really would have had to rush this upstairs. And then Fred has the audacity to say, "Have you got nothing else for my breakfast?" Now, bear in mind, it says, while Fred walked around the table, surveying, here's what's available to him without having to ask for anybody's help: ham, potted beef, and other cold remnants. And I'm just going to drop the page so you can see the simple menus, right? Think of all the things on here. Let's take the bottom breakfast, just because. So there would have been scones probably, or some other kind of bread product available. There probably would have been some kind of cooked fruit. You can see that on both menus, and that would have been cold. Apple marmalade, and there's usually one or two types of cold meat, which you can see if I go back to page 99 now. You'll see there's meat on the table. He does not, for someone who's come down to breakfast, what probably I'd say an hour and a half after breakfast should have ended, and is asking, why there is nothing else on the table but cold food. Well, the cold food would have been laid out on there, and if he had been so inconsiderate as to get up late, he really should have made himself a breakfast using the cold food and not ask now for coffee and buttered toast, which have to be hurriedly put together, because by this time, dishes will have been washed, and the kitchen staff will be wanting to get on with making the next meal, because preparations for meals took a long time. And once you'd finished one, you pretty much had to start in with preparations for the next. So any hold-up just meant that staff were doing something else rather than getting the next meal ready on time. So, anyway, he's surveying the cold remnants with an air of silent rejection and polite forbearance from signs of disgust. Wow. There's some seriously. But the servant, being well trained, knows not to be the least bit rude, and said, "Should you like eggs?" Or in other words, well, obviously we have to please you. What else would you like that has to be cooked immediately? And I'm going to go straight on. I'm going to close page 99, open page 100, and we'll carry on. Eggs? No. Bring me a grilled bone. Now, bear in mind, I don't think this literally means just a bone. I think what Fred is asking for is some kind of meat chop, a lamb chop, probably, or mutton chop, probably. So he's asking for some kind of piece of very nice meat off the bone. Now, whether this would have been available, I'm looking like, well, that would normally be eaten in the evenings rather than at breakfast. So what it's going to be now is somebody down in the kitchen going to whatever cold store they have to see, do they have that particular cut of meat sitting around? Because again, you had no refrigeration. You had other means of keeping meat preserved, but you had to really get on with it. So what he could be doing too is depriving somebody. There'll be a problem now, and there might have to be some extra shopping done. Someone might have to be sent out to a butcher to get meat to replace the meat that Fred eats now. Might have been set aside for lunch, and Fred may know that as well. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he knows perfectly well that what he's eating now is meant to be served at lunch or at dinner, and so what they're going to have to do is maybe change the menu or send a servant out to buy a little bit more meat if they don't already have it in. So we are talking about maximum inconvenience here. The rudeness of it is really quite astonishing. They're painting a picture here. "Really, Fred," said Rosamond, when the servant had left the room, "if you must have hot things for breakfast, I wish you would come down earlier. Yeah, I bet most of the household wish that. You can get up at 6 o'clock to go out hunting. I cannot understand why you find it so difficult to get up on other mornings." And he says, of course, in the way that I think we're now beginning to understand what Fred does, is argue back. "That is your want of understanding, Rosie. I can get up to go hunting because I like it." Okay. "What would you think of me if I came down 2 hours after everyone else and ordered grilled bone?" And it's interesting his answer. He says, "I should think you were an uncommonly fast young lady," said Fred, eating his toast with the utmost composure. Let's talk about that word, uncommonly fast. Fast in this context was a slang term. It was short for fashionable, but we've also held on to an understanding that the word fast, when applied to a woman, is one that behaved in a way that called her personal morality into question. In the 19th century, that could be any kind of flouting of convention. So Fred is correct to assess that Rosamond would suffer a greater loss of social reputation if she behaved the same way he did. Why is Fred behaving the way he is? He's made this choice, first of all, to isolate himself, hasn't he? For some reason, he's not completed his education. We're going to see more hints about that. He's withdrawn from family life. He won't come down at meal times. We don't know what his father or younger brother think of him, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were very unhappy. Rosamond is unhappy. The only person who seems to accept him is his mother. And what that suggests to me is that Fred is afraid of accepting the future somehow. Something about his future he's not happy with. He doesn't want to accept what's marked out for him, and so he's kind of regressed. He's performing in a way that is childish. He's regressing into a kind of childlikeness. And only his mother, therefore, seems capable of loving him. I don't know. I'd like to understand Fred more. I'm hoping that Eliot will indulge me on that. And so we continue, with Rosamond saying, I cannot see why brothers are to make themselves disagreeable any more than sisters. And then Fred, in self-defense, I don't make myself disagreeable. Okay? You might be the only one that thinks this way. I do not make myself disagreeable. It is you who find me so. Disagreeable is a word that describes your feelings and not my actions. So someone's been taught rhetorical argument, but isn't using it necessarily that well. Rosamond said, I think it describes the smell of grilled bone, which is nice and witty. Nice and witty. Fred comes back, not at all. It describes a sensation in your little nose associated with certain finicking notions, which are the classics of Mrs. Lemon's school. He seems to know a lot about that. Look at my mother. You don't see her objecting to everything except what she does herself. She is my notion of a pleasant woman. Wow. Okay, Fred. So women should never object to anything except what they do for themselves. That's a good woman. Well, his mother is interesting. His mother, again, makes me think of a very good hotelier. I kept thinking of the innkeeper's daughter concept, someone who would put up with the worst kind of customer and still keep a cheery smile on her face and be all supportive. That's what she's making me think of. And I believe the text backs me up in a little while, but at any rate, right now, I'm just going to scroll up the page because we need to get on here. Bless you both, my dears, and don't quarrel, said Mrs. Vincy, with motherly cordiality. She's just full of that motherly cordiality. Come, Fred, tell us about the new doctor. How is your uncle pleased with him? And of course, I misunderstood that, and I immediately thought Mr. Bulstrode, because in Chapter 10, we already know that Mr. Bulstrode was keen on Dr. Lidgett and wanted to have him as run his new hospital. So I thought it was Bulstrode, but we'll see, I was wrong. Pretty well, I think. He asks Lidgett all sorts of questions and then screws up his face while he hears the answers, as if they were pinching his toes. That's his way. Ah, here comes my grilled bone. But how came you to stay out so late, my dear? You only said you were going to your uncle's. Oh, I dined at Plymdale's. We had whist. Lydgate was there, too. We'll pause here just really quickly. I dined at Plymdale's. Some people might think, is that a gentleman's club? I had my doubts because gentlemen's clubs were confined at that time to the larger cities. London, there were one in Manchester, a couple in Birmingham, Liverpool, but not in a smaller area such as Middlemarch. And I did a little bit of research and I found out that we're going to meet a character called Plymdale by and by. So Fred Vincy must have been invited by the Plymdales to join them for dinner and whist, a card game, join them for cards afterwards. It's also another way that Fred is keeping a distance between himself and his family, though. Did you see? And maybe his father in particular, maybe that's what all this dodging about really is. It's so that he can be only in the company of his mother, because his mother seems somehow to be indulging behavior that, and I wonder if his father would. And what do you think of him? So this is Mrs. Vincy wanting to know, what does Fred think of Dr. Lidgett? He is very gentlemanly, I suppose. They say he is of excellent family, his relations quite county people, so she's wanting to know what's his status, what's his familial status. Yes, said Fred, there was a Lydgate at John's, who spent no end of money. Now, what he means is when he went to Oxford, and so when he says John's, he means St. John's College, Oxford. So he's saying there was a Lydgate there at that college who spent no end of money. Now, for him to know that, he's either heard a lot of wild rumors, and it wouldn't be good for him to pass on something like that, or maybe he's been the recipient of some of that generous spending. Be interesting to know. I find that this man is a second cousin of his. Okay, so in other words, Lydgate is the second cousin of this gentleman who was at St. John's University, Oxford, who did have a lot of money, or he spent money. Maybe we should be careful there. He spent money, didn't necessarily say he had it. But rich men may have very poor devils for second cousins, possibly. Or possibly what we're getting a hint at here is that the Lydgates can go through money. Whether they can make it as fast as they spend it, we shall see. It always makes a difference, though, to be a good family, said Rosamond, with a tone of decision, and she's good at that, which showed that she had thought on this subject. Rosamond felt that she might have been happier if she had not been the daughter of a Middlemarch manufacturer. She disliked anything which reminded her that her mother's father had been an innkeeper. That was what all that fuss was about, saying the pick of them. Certainly anyone remembering the fact might think that Mrs. Vincy had the air of a very handsome, good-humoured landlady, accustomed to the most capricious orders of gentlemen. Yes, exactly. That's what I said. She just has this air of, I have learned to be good-humoured in spite of the behaviour of most of my male guests. I thought it was odd his name was Tertius, said the bright-faced matron, but of course it's a name in the family. Now, I should have looked up Tertius. What does Tertius mean? Would anybody like to leave something in the comments? Because obviously it's a Latin name, but I don't know what it means, and I should have looked it up. That's very remiss of me. But now, tell us exactly what sort of man he is. And he says, oh, tallish, dark, clever, talks well, rather a prig, I think. Okay, now you know, as soon as he said the word prig, he does not like the man. And Rosamond objects. She says, I never can make out what you mean by a prig. A fellow who wants to show that he has opinions. Why, my dear, doctors must have opinions, said Mrs. Vincy. What else? What are they there for else? Yes, mother, the opinions are paid for. That is, a doctor's opinions. But a prig is a fellow who is always making you a present of his opinions. Well, that describes Fred Vincy as much as it might describe anyone else. I suppose Mary Garth admires Mr. Lydgate, said Rosamond, not without a touch of innuendo. Rosamond's working tactically now. Does she have any rivals for his affection? Fred knows what she's doing immediately. And he says here, really, I can't say, meaning I'm not going to tell you. I think what he means is I know, but I'm not going to say anything. Really, I can't say, said Fred, rather glumly, as he left the table, and taking up a novel which he had brought down with him, threw himself into an armchair. If you are jealous of her, go oftener to Stone Court yourself, and eclipse her. Stone Court is the residence of the rich Mr. Featherstone. Rosamond has no answer, so she simply must say to him, I wish you would not be so vulgar, Fred. By vulgar she means I wish you would not be honest. I wish you would dance around the truth the way I'm doing, because that is considered the politer way to do things. If you have finished, pray, ring the bell. It is true, though, what your brother says, Rosamond, Mrs. Vincy began, when the servant had cleared the table. It is 1,000 pities you haven't patience to go and see your uncle more, so proud of you as he is, and wanted you to live with him. Why, that's interesting. There's no knowing what he might have done for you as well as for Fred. God knows I'm fond of having you at home with me, but I can part with my children for their good. And now it stands to reason that your Uncle Featherstone will do something for Mary Garth. Mary Garth can bear being at Stone Court because she likes that better than being a governess, said Rosamond, folding up her work. I would rather not have anything left to me if I must earn it by enduring much of my uncle's cough and his ugly relations. Back up a bit. What does she say about Mary Garth? She likes being at Stone Court better than she would want to be a governess. That suggests to me that Mary Garth is somehow unfortunate. Lost parents, lost a parent her only future, if she doesn't come from a good family and hasn't got a great dowry, her best bet is that Mr. Featherstone can perhaps introduce her to a young man who might at least give her a steady, good living. The only other option for her is to become a governess, and that was a tough life. And I think most people who read 19th century English novels, they quickly find out about what the life of a governess is like. Jane Eyre is the first and the most popular novel that people read, and they find out that the life of a governess was not easy. There were well-to-do women who did the job, but they did it because they had no choice. They couldn't get a good marriage, and so they had to earn their own money, and they had to try to keep some appearance of gentility by working in the home of a much wealthier family. But they themselves had no security whatsoever. And Rosamond is basically saying, I think I have more options than that. I don't think I have to sacrifice what I enjoy in order to get what I want. Anyway, we resume with Mrs. Vincy, and she's talking about Mr. Featherstone. She says, he can't be long for this world. Since Rosamond has just mentioned his cough, he can't be long for this world, my dear. I wouldn't hasten his end, but what with asthma and that inward complaint, heaven only knows what that is, let us hope there is something better for him in another. She means in another life. In other words, well, let's hope he gets to heaven soon. And I have no ill will towards Mary Garth, I wonder. But there's justice to be thought of. Ooh, I don't know what she means by that. And Mr. Featherstone's first wife brought him no money, as my sister did. Her nieces and nephews can't have so much claim as my sisters. And I must say, I think Mary Garth, a dreadful plain girl, more fit for a governess. Oh, that is so catty, so catty. Oh, I think what we're seeing now is the slight erosion of Mrs. Vincy's matronly cordiality, or I can't remember exactly how it was put, but we're starting to see her real self, which is a little mercenary. I don't think that Rosamond, as an apple, falls very far from Mrs. Vincy as a tree, if you follow me. Mrs. Vincy, after all, has improved her social standing by marrying Mr. Vincy. So I think Rosamond is a chip off that block, if you will. Everyone would not agree with you there, Mother, said Fred, who seemed to be able to read and listen too. Well, my dear, said Mrs. Vincy, wheeling skillfully. So there we go. She's good at arguing with Fred just as much as Rosamond is. She said, if she had some fortune left her, that is, if Mary had some money, a man marries his wife's relations, and the Garths are so poor, and live in such a small way. Well, of course they do. They don't have the same amount of money. But I shall leave you to your studies, my dear, for I must go and do some shopping. Fred's studies are not very deep, said Rosamond, rising with her mamma. He is only reading a novel. Well, by and by he'll go to his Latin and things, said Mrs. Vincy, soothingly, stroking her son's head. How old is he? There's a fire in the smoking room on purpose. It's your father's wish, you know, Fred, my dear. And I always tell him you will be good and go to college again to take your degree. Okay. The mother is holding the father at bay. Mrs. Vincy, with promises that I don't think she can back up with any evidence, she's promising Mr. Vincy Fred will go back to college. Fred will go back to St. John's, if he also went to St. John's, and finish his degree. But what it says here in the text, sadly, is Fred drew his mother's hand down to his lips, but said nothing. I thought I'd dig up this little clip. This is from the 1994 BBC television series that covered Middlemarch, and this is the scene of Fred and Rosamond in the breakfast room with that very overly warm fire. You can see what a lovely house it is. And I'm going to use that as backdrop now when we go back to page 102, and we pick up on their conversation, just the two of them. So let's start from Rosamond. She says, I suppose you are not going out riding today, said Rosamond, lingering a little after her mamma was gone. No. Why? Papa says I may have the chestnut to ride now. You can go with me tomorrow, if you like, only I am going to Stone Court, remember. I want to ride so much, it is indifferent to me where we go. But then, of course, the text says, Rosamond really wished to go to Stone Court of all other places. So she's already setting her sights. She's taking her brother's advice, because he did say, go to Stone Court if you want to see this, how things are between Lidget and Mary Garth, if you're so worried. Oh, I say, Rosie, said Fred, as she was passing out of the room, if you are going to the piano, come, let me play some airs with you. And she says, pray do not ask me this morning. And he says, why not this morning? Really, Fred, I wish you would leave off playing the flute. A man looks very silly playing the flute, and you play so out of tune. When next anyone makes love to you, Miss Rosamond, I will tell him how obliging you are. I must explain here, makes love, making love, was a different term then than it was now. A lot of you will know this, so forgive me while I just explain. When anyone makes love to you means when any man keeps company with you, with a view to getting to know you better, with a view to offering you a proposal of marriage. That was called making love. Okay, so when the next anyone makes love to you, Miss Rosamond, I will tell him how obliging you are. In other words, if this is how you are with me, I'll just drop hints to any future suitors about just how difficult you are when a man has a request to make of you. So Rosamond said, why should you expect me to oblige you by hearing you play the flute, any more than I should expect you to oblige me by not playing it? So she's trying an argument again. And Fred's ready for this. He knows now. He knows exactly what she wants and so how to undermine her refusal. He says, and why should you expect me to take you out riding? And she's caught there. Because unfortunately, a young woman of her position, if she's well trained, she should know you do not go out riding alone. He's blackmailing her effectively. He says, if you want me to escort you when you go out riding tomorrow, then you must tolerate me playing the flute. You must sit and play the piano. We've heard Rosamond sort of give a hint that she isn't prepared to sacrifice anything to get what she wants. But reality doesn't always work out that way. And here's one instance where it doesn't. This question led to an adjustment. For Rosamond had set her mind on that particular ride. So that's what she wants. Now she must make a small sacrifice to get it. So Fred was gratified with nearly an hour's practice of Archedinos or Ye Banks and Braes and other favorite airs from his instructor on the flute. I presume that's his music book. A wheezy performance into which he threw much ambition and an irrepressible hopefulness. Maybe he's happy to play the flute badly. At any rate, we now come to the end of the chapter, and we see what a peculiar pair these two are. We understand the reason why Rosamond sat with her embroidery longer than she meant to. She was waiting for Fred to come downstairs, I think because she wanted to know. She knew where he'd been. And she knows that she's been given permission to ride a horse, but she can't just head out on her own and go where she wants. So she needs to persuade her brother to go with her. She knows that her brother visits Stone Court. And so all of this, you can just see how tactical she's being. And yes, she's had to make a sacrifice now. She can't get everything she wants without a sacrifice. Maybe that theme will be revisited. Maybe we will find that she desires other things and finds that she can't get them without sacrificing something that she wants. I tell you what makes for an interesting discussion here. Is it better to be less or more obvious about what one desires? Both of these young people are kind of hiding a little bit. They're not being 100% honest about what they desire. In the 19th century, you weren't supposed to be direct about what you desired, and particularly not if you were a woman. But Fred is mostly direct insofar as we're talking about what he wants. He just comes out and does it without any consideration for anyone. Rosamond tries to conceal what she really wants, though it's clear that she can make up her mind just as well as Fred. So there's a similarity between them and also a difference. And I'm very interested in these two characters. I really would like to see where they go from here. And so the next chapter we'll get to visit Stone Court, meet its inhabitants. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody there at the next Middlemarch meditation. So thanks very much, everyone, for checking out this one, and I'll see you again next time.